The Victorian electorate of Goldstein includes the suburbs of Caulfield South, Brighton, Bentley and Mackinnon, and is a direct neighbour to Melbourne's traditional Bagel Belt suburbs of Caulfield and East St Kilda that fall into the adjacent electorate of Macnamara. Both electorates are home to approximately 160,000 people, and with a population of 10,000 Jews in Goldstein, it is very significant in relation to Macnamara's 16,000. So when it comes to voting in this year's federal election, you would think that candidates in these two Jewishly flavoured electorates would be mindful in appealing to voters who have some interest in Israel. But never underestimate the virtue signalling left, because the actions of one of the independent candidates in Goldstein indicates how unfriendly to Israel she really is. Zoe Daniel is one of the heavily subsidised climate activists parachuted into various electorates around the country. And putting aside the supposed climate emergency that they are all in hysterics about, this woman is openly hostile to Israel. It will come as no surprise that Zoe Daniel is a former senior journalist with the ABC, but the real kicker is that she is one of the signatories to a petition circulating at the time of last year's war with Hamas that blatantly criticised Israel for defending itself and with absolutely no regard for the facts. This petition talked about, quote, Israeli settler organisations threatening Palestinians in occupied East Jerusalem with forced expulsions, and how Israel maintains an apartheid regime against Palestinians. It went on to erase all Jewish connection to the Temple Mount, warning of, quote again, Israeli vigilante mobs attacking Palestinians. The petition called on journalists and media workers to basically advocate against Israel by prioritising the Palestinian perspective and ignoring any of the facts behind the Hamas-instigated war of May 2021 and Israel's need to defend its citizens. When challenged about it, all she could say was that, quote again, she did not take into account the complexity of the situation at the time in which Israel's security was under threat. Now, there are certainly times when criticism of Israel will be justified, but this must come from a position of truth and honesty, and especially from journalists. To deliberately whitewash the ongoing Palestinian-Arab war against Israel with its aim of eradicating Israel as a Jewish state is simply beyond the pale. And this old chestnut of apartheid is so outrageous, so blatantly false, and so filled with venom, it is hard to define it as anything other than unapologetic anti-Semitism. Putting her name onto this position as Zoe Daniel did only a year ago discredits everything she stands for and seriously questions her suitability to stand for Parliament. As it happens, she has now backpedalled furiously to undo the damage and said she is going to learn from this incident and better understand the issues from the perspective of the Jewish people. Well, that's very nice, but what about from the perspective of the truth? And isn't it interesting how she suddenly found some empathy for Israel only after she landed in an electorate with a strong Jewish presence? But it doesn't end there. Back in 2017, when President Trump moved the US Embassy to Jerusalem, Zoe Daniel described his motivation for this as, quote, satisfying his wealthy Jewish donors. But in fact, Trump said that it was the pro-Israel Christians, more than the Jews, who were the most influential on this issue. People may or may not be looking for alternatives to the Liberals and Labor at this election, and in our system of governance there should always be a place for independent candidates. But with her transparent and opportunistic backflipping, this woman has lost all credibility to fair-minded Australians who support Israel. Ultimately, the voters of Goldstein will sit in judgment of her, but Zoe Daniel's suitability to represent the electorate must surely be called into question here. The Jewish world is approaching the festival of Pesach, or Passover. So I will conclude by noting that inconsequential candidates like Zoe Daniel may come and go, but Pesach is an eternal reminder that the Jewish people have survived and thrived for thousands of years. And wannabe heroes such as the virtue signalling Zoe Daniel will find that history leaves them far behind. On behalf of the Australian Jewish Association, this is Alan Freedman, wishing all our Jewish friends a Chag Sameach.